Welcome to Stoic Conversations. My name is Caleb Ontiveros,
And I'm Michael Tremblay.
and today we're going to be talking about metacognition in Stoicism. What's that all about?
Yeah, so this is something I wanted to talk about. I'm not a psychologist, so I don't know if anybody listens to this and has psychological training and wants to call me out on anything. Feel free to send an email. But this is a psychological concept, metacognition. It's a relatively modern one, but I think it's really relevant for Stoicism. There's a lot of overlap here. And so I'm going to kind of explore. I'm going to explore the role that metacognition plays in Stoicism and the role that metacognition plays in Stoic practice, because this is a podcast about practicing Stoicism as well. And I thought it was an interesting connection that seems to me really relevant. I don't see it made that often, but seems to me very relevant. So, what is metacognition? Well, metacognition is defined as an awareness or understanding of one's own thinking and the patterns behind them. So this was defined by developmental psychologist John H. Flavel, I think is how you say his name, in 1976. So as I said, relatively recent, especially compared to Stoicism. Um, and what metacognition is it refers to a level of thinking and regulation of thinking, specifically the regulation of cognition and the subsequent learning experiences that help people enhance their learning through a set of activities. That's that's your Wikipedia definition. But what that means is it's really about the object of your thought. So whenever you're thinking about your thinking, whenever the thing you're talking about or reflecting upon is the way in which you think, that's metacognition. So on one hand, you have the actual content of what you're talking about. If you're talking about thinking and the way you think, that's metacognition. And the other thing it involves something called metacognitive control, which is really your capacity to then direct your thinking or direct the content of your thinking moving forward. So it's both a reflection on the subject of your thinking and the ability to control to control that subject. So I let me try an example to parse through that. So here would be an example of metacognition related to self-improvement or stoicism. You might say something like, I'm a person who tends to jump to conclusions. That's a metacognitive claim because it's thinking about the way that you think, thinking, well, I often, I'm often quick to assume things. That's a metacognitive claim. And then I might also think, so, when someone proposes an idea, I'm going to pause for a minute to consider if I agree or not. And that's an example of practicing metacognitive control and attention, which is to say, I'm directing my thinking. I'm actually changing the way that I think and applying that control over my thought processes. Yeah, so that's metacognition in a nutshell. It's just a way of talking about a certain type of thought process and a certain type of, I guess, content of thought, which is thinking about thinking, and then also a kind of a practical aspect, which is controlling what you think about as well. Anything you'd add to that, Caleb?
I think that's well put. Yeah, it's in slogan form. I like how you put it, just thinking about thinking, and then you get more specific with, okay, there are these two different, at least in the modern way of talking about metacognition, you've got those two different aspects, control as well as a metacognitive knowledge that I'm sure you'll get into a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
It's a useful framework that, of course, has significant overlap with Stoicism. It's a modern way of speaking, I suppose, but I do want to flag that, of course, I think the ancients touched on this idea. It's not especially novel, though it has developed into, say, different forms of therapies or thinking about development in particular in the modern context. But I think of many of the ancient Greeks, of course, talked about thinking in a sense. The Delphic command is metacognitive, know yourself.
Hmm.
Heraclitus, I go in search of myself, is perhaps the beginnings of thinking about these sorts of issues. So, yeah, I think we should tie together some of these modern strands and these modern developments with some of the ancient Greco-Roman thought, Stoicism in particular. In this conversation should be fun.
Yeah, well, and that's what I wanted to do. Is I'm not arguing Stoicism should have talked about metacognition. What I'm going to argue here is that the Stoics were actually really focused on metacognition, and metacognition is just a way of, I guess, summarizing a lot of the things the Stoics were talking about and doing. And I found it a helpful mindset shift when I thought, okay, well, we're talking about metacognition here. That for me was like a helpful way to I guess connect a number of different Stoic ideas. And so I'm going to do that. I'll start with Stoicism or metacognition in Stoic theory, and then move on to metacognition in Stoic practice, really, and the role it plays in both. So the first thing I wanted to do is just make an argument that's which you agreed with. Maybe it's not that controversial, but Stoicism in large part centers around metacognition. Metacognition plays a really important role, even though they didn't use that exact language, in what Stoicism is. The first role metacognition plays in Stoicism is that it really is, I'll argue, the basis of philosophy, or as you were talking about with Socrates and Heraclitus, the basis of the ability to do philosophy. And an argument for that, this is Epictetus's Discourses 1.1. So this is the very first thing. If you haven't read Epictetus's Discourses, I know you have, Caleb, but those listening, this is the very first thing Epictetus says. Very first thing, first line of the first page. Epictetus says the following. He says, of the arts and faculties in general, you'll find none that contemplates and consequently approves of or disapproves of itself. How far does the contemplative power of grammar extend? As far as the judging of language. Of music, as far as the judgment of melody. Thus, when you're writing to a friend, all grammar will tell you is that this is the way you should write. But whether or not you are to write to your friend at all, grammar will not tell you. What will tell you then? The faculty which contemplates both itself and all other things. And what is that? The reasoning faculty. For that alone of the faculties which we have received comprehends both itself, what it is, what it's capable of, and with what valuable powers it has come to us, and all the other faculties likewise. And so what Epictetus is making this argument is that whenever you develop any sort of craft. So there's often this analogy that Stoicism is like a craft, right? It's like learning an instrument. It's like playing a sport. But he says philosophy is very different from these other crafts in a way, because sport will tell you how to play a sport, but it isn't able to contemplate the act of playing a sport. Is sport worthwhile? Should we change the rules? What does it mean to play a game? Music tells you the notes to play, tells you the technique to use, but it doesn't. Musical theory, and maybe this is a bit simplistic, but musical theory doesn't have that contemplative aspect about the function of music, the point of music, or really whether we should play music at all. But thinking is different. The faculty of reason is different in that it both provides these rules of good reasoning. Well, that's a logical fallacy. This is how the premises to an argument works. It has the kind of content of reasoning. But then it also reflects upon itself, and you can reason about reasoning. And really what I would say is you can do metacognition. You can think about thinking. And in that way, the faculty of reasoning is different from these other crafts. It's what actually sets it apart and is what makes it special. And so later, just to build on that, later in the same passage, just a little bit later on, Epictetus in the voice of Zeus says, I have given you, says this to his students, I have given you a certain portion of myself. This faculty of exerting the impulse to act and not to act, and desire and aversion, and in a word, making proper use of impressions. If you attend to this and place all that you have in its care, you'll never be restrained, never be hindered, you will not groan, you will not find fault, you will not flatter any man. And so there's this claim here. So we have this faculty of reason, and then Epictetus, embodying Zeus, says, I've given you this special thing, this actual portion of myself, this actual divine ability. So it's not like there's all these crafts and thinking has this certain quirk. The metacognitive aspect of the faculty of thinking, its self-reflective aspect is divine, is special, sets it apart, puts it above all these other crafts. What do you think about that?
Well, how does that connect to something we've talked about before, which is this 4-step process from Epictetus's? psychology, where you have impression, reflection, assent, and then impulse. You see metacognition coming in both at that reflection and assent stage, or how do you think about that?
Yeah, maybe I'll get ahead to my next part because I think it connects. I think it connects exactly that 4-step process. So I'll jump ahead. Well, I'll just keep going and then we'll get to that question because I think
Yeah,
that's a good
cool.
question. So the other argument I'm going to make then is so Epictetus calls out metacognition. He says it's special, but there's this other argument in Stoicism that actually humans are capable of doing philosophy because we possess metacognition. It's actually what enables us, makes it possible. And so the reason it's necessary, and the argument for this basically is that we can only reflect on impressions because our impressions are lecta, they're verbal representations of situations. So lecta is, just what is said, that we can train our mind to reflect upon. So this is a bit technical, but basically, if we contrast this with animals, the basic argument is the animals can't do philosophy. They can't participate in self-directed self-improvement because they're not able to reflect. They're not able to reflect because they're nonverbal. Because they're nonverbal, animals become these input-output machines that you're able to train. So I have 2 cats. If I put the cat food down, my cat smells the cat food and goes crazy for the cat food. Right? They're still receiving an impression, but they don't have this special ability to recognize that it's an impression, pause, reflect upon the impression, and then carefully give assent. Humans can do this because we don't actually reason about direct impressions. We don't actually reflect upon direct impressions of the world according to Stoicism. What we do is we make a kind of mental representation, which is the lecta, which is to say we think about or conceptualize the impression. Someone smacks into us, bumps into us. I always use this example, but somebody bumps into us, and I think, oh, that person just bumped into me. What a jerk. That's the lecta. That's the representation of the situation in my mind that has aspects that are objective, has aspects that are subjective or value judgments. And that's what we're actually reflecting upon and assenting to as a Stoic. It's kind of an imprecise use of language when we say we assent to an impression. We assent to really our representation or our lecta, our description of it, right? And that ability is what sets us apart from animals. That ability, and then that's also what sets us apart from children. So the Stoics also have these arguments that babies or small children, they don't have reasoning. They're not capable of reason. And that reason comes about, there's disagreements in the literature about that's 7 or 14. I think it's, if you've ever worked with children, I think it's more clearly 7 is more reasonable. 14 is clearly much too old. But which is this idea, I think I'm stretching here, but I would say that the child below 7, 6, 5, 2, whatever age you want, doesn't possess that metacognition, which is they're not verbal. 7's a bit of a stretch here, but they don't have that ability to verbally represent what they're seeing in language and then reflect upon that representation that they can kind of hold in space and time. So that's a long way of getting to an answer to your question, Caleb. But essentially, we receive an impression. So the first part process of Stoic psychology, according to Epictetus, is you have your impression, you reflect upon it, you assent, and then you feel an impulse. What an animal has, they have an impression and an impulse. Because humans have the capacity to reflect upon what they're thinking, reflect upon what they've experienced, reflect upon the content of their minds. They have this metacognitive ability, I would say, that allows for reflection, allows for a pausing, and then it allows for assent. I don't know if assent is metacognition. I think assent is more, it's a decision, it's a judgment, right? It is more just a thought. It is skilled thinking. I don't think it's necessarily metacognition. It's just deciding if something's true or not. When I solve a math problem and I say the multiple choice, the answer is C, even though it's complex, difficult thinking, I don't think it's metacognition. But when I reflect upon, my impulse is A, is that the right answer? What criteria do I use to come to the right answer? Okay, applying that criteria, I actually arrive at C. I do think there's some There's some metacognition going on that's allowing the direction and the directing of your thought process. Um, that's how I've tried to argue it. What do you think about that?
No, yeah, that makes sense to me. It's so you've got it's you think of metacognition, especially that activity, metacognitive control, thinking about thinking. That's reflection. That's thinking about the lecta or sayables for Stoics. What's the meaning of our impressions? But specifically, modern philosophers might talk about the propositions they express and such,
Yeah.
and you can think about the thoughts you're having, and as such, that's a metacognitive activity. And perhaps, in a sense, you might build metacognitive knowledge. So that might be the only thing I would add to what you just said, because you can have decisions about what you think. You might come to say, this thinking style is a good one, this thinking style is a bad one, endorse propositions like that. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that would be encoded as metacognitive knowledge, because you're creating strategies that then you'll later use in other reflections about your thoughts, about, say, in this example, different thinking strategies that work or don't work.
Yeah, you might say something like this habit of assenting carelessly, this habit of
Mhm.
believing whatever anybody tells me, what the news says to me. That's a bad way of thinking. And so that's a kind of metacognitive knowledge, which changes the way that you assent moving forward. It changes the kind of things you believe moving forward. That's what you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah. And so,
And,
oh, go ahead.
well, one other thing that I wanted to call out here as an aside, which I think is really cool, is the way in which Stoicism is fractal. The whole mirrors the parts. The microcosm is reflected in the macrocosm and such. Especially in this story about Zeus, you have Zeus giving humans a portion of themselves. What is that? That here is the ability to make proper use of impressions. In particular, this way of thinking about thinking brings order and purpose to human lives, I suppose. We're able to make sense of our impressions, and then with our purposes, program ourselves to be more than just
Mm-hmm.
input, output machines like computers, or as the Stoics saw animals. And I think that's reflected in this picture of nature as a whole. Zeus has this attribute. What does that mean? Nature has this attribute of reason, and it has its own kind of order and purpose for the ancient Stoics in particular. So you have these ideas of providence. Things have a structure. The universe is intelligible. It is directed towards certain aims. And I think that's just really cool that you have that general picture of nature as having reason, order, and purpose. And then that every human has this fragment of reason themselves, this ability to reason themselves, this fragment of the divine as a part of the greater whole. So I think that part of Stoicism is a very beautiful part of the philosophy.
Yeah, that's really cool. I've never thought of fractal is a good way of putting it. Uh, I just agree. It's a really interesting part of Stoicism. Two things I wanted to add. First is just about animals. I mean, you talked about the input output. I should clarify, because that's the same language I used, that the Stoics think animals are capable of reasoning. We want to be careful about the language you use here. But the Stoics, they use this example of a dog. The dog comes to a fork in the road. It's chasing something, comes to a fork in the road, smells down path number one, doesn't smell anything. Yeah, doesn't smell anything, immediately runs down the second path without taking the time to smell it. And they say, well, that dog is doing this kind of deductive reasoning, right? A or B, not A, therefore B. So I don't even need to test B. I know my prey or what I'm chasing ran down B. But that's a type of reasoning, but the dog is not able to, and everybody knows that who has a relationship with pets, there's this degree of intelligence, but the dog is not able to reason about that capacity. The dog doesn't say, "Well, last time I did A or B, not A, therefore B, but I really didn't leave enough space for an option C, which is maybe it ran off the path. I didn't the dog's not able to conduct this metacognition, right? So I'm not trying to imply the Stoics thought that animals were unintelligent, um, or that a dog is like a bacteria or something like this. This is not. This is doesn't make sense and not what they thought. Just that they were lacking that metacognitive ability. Um, the other thing to add, which I guess is a criticism of Stoicism and bringing in, Caleb, I'm interested in what you think about this. It always strikes me as strange here when Epictetus is pretending to be Zeus or acts out, says the universe has given you a piece of me, like a piece of the divine. When it seems to me, and then they point to that piece as the metacognitive aspect. They say that's the best part of you. That's the part that's the most godlike. And it seems to me the part that we have the least in common with the universe. It seems to me that when I think of the universe, I don't think of its metacognitive ability. And maybe there's some sort of metaphor here, or not even metaphor, but some sort of idea of providence or some sort of other kind of reasoning, but it's not a metacognitive reasoning. The universe isn't thinking about how the universe thinks. That always kind of trips me up. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, the way I thought about it is if we think about the ability for if we're going back to our episode on the Stoic God, and one of the analogies we talked about for the Stoic God was thinking of it as a life force or fire. That thing that
Mm,
ties things together, holds things together, and I like to talk about it as having those two aspects: one order and the other purpose. Things have a certain structure because of the life force, and they're driven in a specific way because of that animating force, essentially that active principle, right? So in that sense, the Stoics thought of maybe this is where we're going to have some difficulty tying out how exactly these are identical, but they thought of reasoning as that basically an exercise of the active principle. It has always been my understanding. So you're bringing order to your life, thinking
mm,
about
yep.
the purposes you have, and sort of applying it to impressions one is receiving. So in that sense, that's how I see it as uh, the same. That's how you share a fragment of the divine, is because you are also able to utilize, when you're thinking well, the logos. You're able to harmonize
Hmm.
with it through exercising your reason well.
And there's probably something when you were talking, I think that made a lot of sense, but I was thinking there's probably something here also about like autonomy or self-expression, which is that you're harmonizing, but you're almost harmonizing through choice. You're
Mhm.
harmonizing with a active awareness of the harmonization, which is probably better than it's like that. I've been thinking about that Stoic metaphor of the person being dragged by the cart, which is to say fate goes along and it pulls you and you can walk alongside the cart or you can be dragged by the cart if you're tied to the cart of fate. And so you're doing the same thing regardless. You end up at the same spot regardless, but there's this almost self-awareness, autonomy, choice, participation. And so you talk about that harmonization, but maybe there's a higher level harmonization when you're, not only are you going along with the providential nature of the universe, but you're aware of that providential universe. You're aware of its purpose and you're choosing the same thing. Probably puts you at a higher level than what an animal is doing, let's say.
Yeah, yeah, I think so. And I think perhaps another way to get at it is thinking about when humans lack reason, then things become disordered. Our
Mm-hmm.
lives lack purpose. Maybe most extreme forms, like if you're extremely tired, very fatigued, or something like this. Your mind's a bit scrambled, and it might in some way mirror, that Epicurean picture of the universe, just randomness.
Yeah.
Things aren't tied together, as opposed to the Stoic picture. Things are intelligible; they make sense. They're going towards a certain end. That's what thinking well looks like. That's what exercising reason well looks like. Yeah.
And I mean, speaking of that, speaking of the disordered mind, so there's this claim that metacognition is unique, or this ability to reason, which I'm now drawing they would call it reasoning. I'm now drawing this. comparison to contemporary psychology's view of metacognition, because I think metacognition draws some aspects of it out that we lose when we think about reasoning. Reasoning's a bit more vague, and I think metacognition is more precise. The Stoics are judgmental of those humans that don't practice their metacognition. There's some metaphors in Epictetus about comparing them to animals. It says you've got a body, and then you've got this piece of the divine. And if you're not sharpening or training that piece of the divine, just thinking about your body, just kind of, oh, I want to eat that, or I want to go pursue this pleasure, then you're acting like the animal, right? You're acting like the input output instead of this active development of how you make use of impressions. And so this would be a Stoic view. I also think of somebody like the Neo in the Matrix, or anybody in the Matrix. There's this judgment of those who live on autopilot. So those
Mhm.
that don't make use of this metacognitive ability. And to go back to your reference to Socrates, or the Oracle of Delphi, which is referenced by Socrates, that maxim of know thyself. It's a call to action for metacognition. It's a call to action to think about how you think, to think about what you think. And that is, I really think there is a claim to be made that is the starting point of ancient Greek philosophy. And so there's a tradition the Stoics are following when they're placing it on such a pedestal, starting at least at Socrates and making its way to the Stoics.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the constants through the Greek philosophical schools is that focus on not sleepwalking through life, not living life on autopilot, but becoming free in some way, and I think that requires some investigation of one's beliefs, thoughts, desires, and that's just metacognition. That's what we've been talking about.
Mm-hmm. And then, so that's metacognition in theory. That's in Stoic theory. That's the role that it plays in Stoic theory, which I've argued is a very big one. It is the starting point of philosophy. It's a necessary condition of philosophy, and it is the most important part of ourselves, the part that we need to really focus on making excellent. And then I think there's a role for metacognition in practice. So something I hit on at the start of the episode, this idea that there's two aspects to metacognition. So one aspect, there's metacognitive knowledge. So an understanding of how you think and judgments or perspectives on thinking. So some examples of metacognitive knowledge I have is just the claim I tend to think these kinds of ways. Like this is how I'm a thoughtful thinker. I'm a careless thinker. These kinds of I I'm really biased about this. Or I have this pattern of thinking, or I'm really easily persuaded when someone makes an appeal to emotion. So there's kind of knowledge about the way that you think. And then there's metacognitive control, which is the ability to focus your attention to, I would say, determine the content of your thoughts. So a metacognitive control is to say, I'm going to work on focusing on my impressions when I receive them, really interrogating them. And that's practicing metacognitive control, which is directing the attention. So again, if you think of attention, like there's these metaphors you can use, but if you think of it like a flashlight, metacognitive knowledge is this awareness, I suppose, really on both what's under the lens of the flashlight and the kind of flashlight you have. Like,
Mhm.
it's got a really wide, it's really focused, or it's got a really wide view. And then a metacognitive control is if you're able to point that, where you're able to point that flashlight for sustained periods of time and how you're able to direct it. And so if we think of metacognition in these two ways, many Stoic exercises or practices fall directly into these two categories. Prosoche, or the mindful, attentive awareness of our own thinking, that Stoic call to be mindful. I think that's an application of metacognition. That's metacognitive control. That focus on, as I said, I'm going to interrogate every impression I receive. I'm not going to assent unless I've thought about the impression. I'm going to be very careful about the beliefs I form because I want to be careful about my impulses and my emotions. That's a kind of metacognitive control. And then other things, these exercises, Other Stoic exercises I really think of as methods of rewriting our unhelpful or incorrect thinking patterns. And so I'm thinking of things like the view from above, memento mori, premeditatio malorum. These are all exercises we've talked about before. And you can think about them not as band aids, not as even tools in the toolbox, but to say applications of metacognitive knowledge. So they say, well, I tend to overestimate my importance, or I really get caught up and I uh, dramatize what's occurring. So that's a metacognitive knowledge. So I'm going to apply the view from above. I'm going to take a big picture perspective. I'm going to extend my view. I tend to be blindsided when things don't go my way. I get really optimistic. That's a metacognitive knowledge. That's metacognitive knowledge. So I'm going to practice premeditatio malorum. I'm going to consider all the bad things that could happen so that I'm not surprised by them. I'm prepared for them. So, I don't want to shove force stoicism into this box, but I do think it's an interesting way of thinking about how we practice. Because often we think about, for me at least, I often think about practice in this almost therapeutic way of like, oh, I've got this problem and I'm going to apply the melody
Mhm.
or the remedies. Sorry, not the melody. I'm going to just listen to some sad music and feel better. I've got this problem. I'm going to apply the remedy, but instead thinking about it. Well, Stoicism about this a big part of Stoicism is this metacognitive skill. I'm going to focus my attention. That's number one. And number two is I'm going to understand where I think poorly. I'm going to be really self-aware because I journal, because I reflect about where I go wrong when I think, and then I'm going to apply the appropriate solution. So it's more, I guess, preventative than reactionary. What do you think on this framing of Stoic practice as this metacognitive practice?
Yeah, I think this is really helpful because, as you said, sometimes if we have a given problem or goal, we go immediately to how can I fix this problem? How can I achieve this goal? Even with it, if we have an excellent Stoic framing, we're thinking about what's up to us. What are those next few decisions that I need to make? And what you're calling attention to here that I think is really useful is that sometimes you almost want to step back a little bit and maybe think of, in a case of a problem, like what are those thinking styles, those beliefs you have that are contributing to the problem. So I think in metacognitive therapy, sometimes people talk about a belief like, I think rumination is a useful way to solve my problems. And it's something like that driving whatever you're facing at hand. And maybe that kind of thinking style, yeah, you want to address that. Um, and that's going to be more promising than tackling whatever is right in front of you. And I think also fits in well with that Stoic project of building character, thinking about yourself as, of course, someone who exists through time. And, one of the essential parts of Stoicism is just that you think about character through time and not just one-off decisions. You're thinking about, what is the what does the most stoic person do in this case? And I think that can generate different answers, perhaps, than just thinking about an isolated decision at this very moment. So what you're bringing out for me here is that sometimes maybe we go a little bit too far into just wanting to solve the problem in the moment, but on the margin, perhaps we ought to move more to at least thinking about, what are these beliefs that are causing some of these issues or might be holding me back from achieving my goal? What are these character traits, thinking styles, and then making progress on those. It might be a little bit harder than fixing the issue at the moment, but it's the kind of project that I think pays
Yeah.
off over time. So that's I think that's a nice reminder and a good thing to call attention to.
Well, I love that idea of Stoicism looks at character over time. And in many ways, I think I'm going to blame Epictetus here. I think sometimes when Epictetus frames it as making proper use of impressions, it can seem like um, Well, that's all doing a good Stoic is. You kind of walk down the street and somebody calls you a bad name and you go, that's nothing to me, or somebody offers you some riches and you go, oh, these are externals. And it's kind of like a whack-a-mole of bad impressions. Um, but the metacognition is this, okay, well, if it is, I'm going to take a step back and I'm going to equip myself with the right tools. I'm going to make sure I know where I tend to fail. I'm really going to understand myself as a thinker. I'm going to understand my faults as a thinker. And it's not as simple as me adeptly navigating the situation, or I should say, it is that simple. Maybe it's that simple for the sage. The real Stoic in progress is about taking a step back, evaluating the kind of the ways you tend to think incorrectly, as you said, making it a longer term project, a more self-aware project. That's now that is really practicing Stoicism, right? It's a deep practice of Stoicism instead of just, oh well, you're feeling sad about this. Have you thought about the dichotomy of control? Now you're less sad. It is really the Stoic goal of knowledge, of being an excellent thinker, is this real long term metacognitive practice, which is not to say they're not unrelated. So we're kind of painting two pictures here, at least the way I'm understanding what you were saying. One is the person who treats Stoicism as like this reactionary, in the moment. Okay, there's a mistake I made. Can I avoid the mistake? Or there's a tempting impression. Can I not get angry or jealous or envious or something like this? And then there's this other thing, which is the person who's writes, journals, meditates, really understands kind of the contours of their own mind and where the faults are. And point one is that you got to be doing that second kind of work. You got to be doing that real metacognitive work. That's point number one, which I think is right. And then point number two, which I'm adding, is that I don't think we dismiss that first kind of work, which is to say, if you've got a really good understanding of yourself and then you go and non-reflectively walk down the street and get upset about things, well, it doesn't help you. There's always that weird thing I notice when somebody's like, oh, I'm an angry person, then they go and get angry. And you're kind of like, well, shouldn't you have put something in place to stop that? Like you still need to be skillful in the moment. That's still an important part of it. But then there's this background work to it too.
No, yeah, I think that's right. The way what I'm understanding what you're saying is you've got this project of, basically the metacognitive project of building up metacognitive knowledge, improving your skills of metacognitive control, attention. Of course, Epictetus talks about this, the importance of attention, I should say, to be clear. But at the same time, you need to do that day-to-day work. Not all knowledge is metacognitive is perhaps a good way to put it.
Oh, that's that. Yeah, I'm interrupting you to say that's the part that I was missing. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
So,
right.
and there certainly is a sense when sometimes people might spend too much time on the metacognitive, and they ought to be spending more time just living in the present and tackling the problem at hand. You have Marcus Aurelius reminding himself to do that. Many anecdotes, perhaps personal experiences of people saying going to things like therapy, learning about the causes of their problems, how it originates in some childhood experience or something like this, and then they come to understand the origin of their problem, and then what's next. Sometimes for
Hmm.
some people, it's not that useful. You're just to know, okay, and I know the origins of my thoughts. I know these different beliefs about thinking styles, but there's maybe something there still that's missing that needs to be applied, and I think that's part of both a metacognitive skill and a cognitive skill as well. So yeah, I think you do need both of those aspects, and I think Marcus Aurelius, perhaps in his Meditations, is a good example of how you might apply both of those, where he's doing both of those things at the same time, reminding himself to be present, focus on the task at hand, while also thinking through, about the character traits he
Hmm.
admires or particular ways of thought that he thinks he needs to correct, different thinking styles he needs to correct, and strategies for overcoming that, whether that's anger, anxiety, or what have you.
Yeah, I think that's a good example. Why not? It's just not a dichotomy, right? Like, why not both? But as you raised, I'm going to keep going back to that phrase of not all knowledge is metacognitive. So to understand your own thinking is not sufficient. You need to go out then and think well. So you do need to go out and navigate the situations effectively. I think what we're landing on is, or not only A, not only B, getting a good mix of a good Stoic practice looks like a mix of going out and navigating your particular messy, stressful life and the roles you have and the parts you have to play in it well. And then it also involves going back and journaling, reflecting, thinking about how your thinking contributed to what you did well and what you did poorly. So kind of fluctuating between those two states. Anything you want to hit on that we haven't talked about before I get to my conclusion?
One thing I'd like to emphasize is that those list of Stoic exercises that you hit on, which uh, um, which I think can be essential, useful for improving metacognitive skill, whether that's building up attention of your own thinking, or also taking that view from above, practicing cognitive distancing. Donald Robertson is very very good about this, or using some of those other traditional Stoic exercises to get distance, get some perspective on how you're living your life, what your thinking patterns are. In Epictetus's language, how you reflect on the impressions you face, whether that's memento mori, premeditatio malorum, or maybe even practicing voluntary discomfort and seeing if you come to insights about your thinking styles and such. So I think those are good things to emphasize, to experiment with, and to tinker with, as you become more Stoic.
Yeah, I guess that's the main takeaways. So, okay, we've talked about metacognition. How do you practice it? Um, well, you practice it by being reflective. You practice it then by applying these kinds of exercises to change your thinking, as you said, and then you practice applying mindfulness and attention. You practice that metacognitive control as well, which you have to do these things, right? It's not easy to
Mhm.
sit there and premeditatio malorum in a healthy way. It's easy to ruminate, so, or memento mori in a healthy way, to think about death in a way that is instructive or insightful. Yeah, so that's all really helpful. Um, and so to wrap up here, I I'll just summarize what we went over. I've introduced this idea of metacognition, which is an awareness or understanding of one's own thinking and the patterns behind it. Um, and then this was not something the Stoics talked about, but basically saying, hey, I think this is really important how the ancient Greeks think about philosophy more generally and the Stoics specifically, and bore out some examples of that. How Epictetus talks about how this ability to be reflective is something special. It's something God has given us, something that is different from all the other crafts or all the other really skills we can engage in, sets it apart from everything else. And it is the craft of philosophy is this thinking about thinking, or at least I might say it's the foundation of it, or it's a necessary component of it. And the Stoics even go so far as to say, as we talked about, that humans are only capable of doing philosophy and we're set apart from other kinds of things because of this metacognitive ability. It is the thing that lets us, instead of just thinking, like the dog who is still thinking, but the dog who just goes about and pursues their goals non-reflectively, it lets us reflect on our goals. It lets us reflect on our beliefs. It lets us reflect on our first impressions and reflect on whether we're doing that well or poorly as well, right? Whether we're being effective at trying to think well. And that sets us apart from animals. It also sets us apart from small children. There's just this type difference here. And then the last thing was that in those, a lot of Stoic exercises are about developing your metacognition by either developing this metacognitive control, your ability to control your focus, or by intervening on incorrect or unhelpful thinking patterns that you've recognized in yourself, by reflection or by self awareness. And I think one of the upshots we've got, Caleb, from this conversation was that thinking about metacognition as an important part of your practice, uh, it helps put that focus in that long term project of Stoicism.
Mhm.
Helps put that focus on, it's not just about driving in traffic and not getting upset, as frustrating as traffic can be. It's a multi-year, decade process of turning yourself into the best thinker you can be and the best person you can be, because the better you are at thinking, the more truthful your thoughts, the better you will be as a person. And so it shifts the focus also into that domain, instead of this stoicism that's about kind of playing defense, I would say, of just, okay, you're upset because you thought something false. How can I become not upset in this moment? Which is part of stoicism. It's part of stoic therapy, but it's not the entire project. And
Yeah, absolutely. I always like that offensive versus defensive framing on stoicism, and stoicism is so useful for defense, becoming more resilient. But I think ultimately the project has that positive vision as well. That's essential to it, and I think that's what most people learn when they practice stoicism. I think, of course, personally, I found the focus on resilience, defensive stoicism initially attractive, and then discovered there's this whole life philosophy behind the system, and it aims at something positive. It has that purpose. That's an essential part of stoicism.
mm-hmm. I think it's a
Awesome.
great note to end on.
Cool. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, Gil.
Thanks for listening to Stoic Conversations. Please give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and share it with a friend. If you want to dive deeper still, search Stoa in the App Store or Play Store for a complete app with routines, meditations, and lessons designed to help people become more stoic. And I'd also like to thank Michael Levy for graciously letting us use his music. You can find more of his work at ancientlyre.com. And finally, please get in touch with us. Send a message to stoa@stoameditation.com if you ever have any feedback, questions, or recommendations. Until next time.